Edward was a striking figure, with his pale complexion, jet black hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. His most distinctive feature, however, were his hands, which were not hands at all, but rather long, sharp blades that glinted in the light. Despite his fearsome appearance, there was a certain vulnerability about him. He seemed almost childlike in his naivety and innocence, as if he had been sheltered from the world his entire life. His movements were hesitant and uncertain, as if he was afraid he might hurt someone with his deadly appendages. Yet there was also a certain grace to his movements. He moved with a fluidity that was almost otherworldly, as if he was dancing to a rhythm that only he could hear. And when he wielded his scissor hands, he did so with a precision and skill that was almost beautiful to watch. To those who took the time to get to know him, Edward was a gentle soul, with a heart full of love and compassion. He had a childlike wonder about him, and a sense of innocence that was almost contagious. But to those who didn't understand him, he was a monster, a freak of nature to be feared and avoided at all costs. Despite the many challenges he faced, Edward never lost his sense of wonder and curiosity. He continued to explore the world around him, always looking for new ways to create and express himself. And even when the world seemed against him, he never gave up hope that someday he might find a place where he truly belonged. Edward Scissorhands had always been an outsider, never quite fitting in with the rest of the community. Despite his kind heart and gentle nature, his scissor hands made him an object of fear and suspicion to those around him. It was a dark and stormy night when Edward's world came crashing down. He had been out wandering in the woods, lost in thought, when he stumbled upon a group of young teens who were up to no good. They had been drinking and smoking, and when they saw Edward, they decided to have some fun at his expense. At first, they taunted him, calling him names and making fun of his strange appearance. But then, things took a turn for the worse. One of the teens grabbed hold of Edward's arm, causing him to instinctively lash out with his scissor hands. The boy stumbled back, blood pouring from his wounds, and the others erupted into a frenzy. Word of the attack spread quickly through the small town, and soon, a mob of angry townspeople had gathered outside the Boggs family home, where Edward had been staying. They banged on the doors and windows, shouting for Edward to be turned over to them. As the night wore on, the crowd grew more and more frenzied, fueled by rumors and hearsay. Some claimed that Edward was a dangerous lunatic who had come to the town to wreak havoc. Others fell into a league with the neighbor Esmerelda, the odd mousy woman who was never seen without a big clunky Bible. Esmerelda had said all along that he was a demon, sent from hell to punish them for their sins. And now others were beginning to think the strange woman was right. The Boggs family, who had taken Edward in and cared for him, knew they had to act fast. They helped him escape the angry mob and brought him safely back up to his castle on the mountain. But things were not as they seemed. The Boggs family had been staunch defenders of Edward, even in the face of overwhelming opposition from the rest of the town. They had taken him in and given him a place to stay, showing him kindness and compassion when no one else would. But something changed when Edward took them up to the castle on the mountain. At first, everything seemed to be going well. The family marveled at the strange, Gothic architecture of the place, and Edward showed them his various creations, from the intricate ice sculptures to the topiary gardens. But then, things started to take a dark turn. As they explored the castle, the family began to notice strange and unsettling things. They stumbled upon a room filled with bizarre contraptions, each more macabre than the last. And then, they found the room with the preserved body parts, each one carefully labeled and catalogued. The Boggs family was horrified, and they demanded an explanation from Edward. But he was unable to give them one, simply staring at them with his piercing black eyes, his scissor hands at the ready. As the tension mounted, the family began to feel increasingly uneasy. They realized that they were in way over their heads, and that they had no idea what kind of person Edward really was. It was then that they made the fateful decision to turn on him, accusing him of being a monster and a danger to society. Edward was stunned by their sudden change of heart, and he tried to plead with them, to explain that he had never meant to harm anyone. But it was too late. The Boggs family had made up their minds, and they were determined to see Edward punished for his supposed crimes. Peg Boggs and her husband Jim ran screaming from the crumbling, decaying castle, followed by their children Kevin and Kim. The family was too frightened to even stop for their car, instead running at full sprint down the hill. The angry people of the town were still gathered at the foot of the hill. Upon hearing the cries of the Boggs family, the sheriff jumped into his cruiser and raced up the hill with his sirens blaring and red and blue lights flashing. Devastated and confused, Edward went quietly. Nonetheless, the sheriff treated him roughly, cruelly throwing him into the cruiser. Edward's dangerous hands sliced into his face and he cried out as wincing gashes opened on his pale cheeks. He was transported at top speed out of town. Tears slipped down his face, burning his wounds, as he watched out the rear windshield, the snarling, insane faces of the torch-wielding townspeople who had been his friends only hours before. The cruiser raced on into the night, further and further into the middle of nowhere until finally it turned off onto an all but hidden road. They climbed another hill, shrouded in trees and shadows cast by the eerie full moon high overhead. Finally, they emerged into a tangled clearing in front of a sprawling asylum. Lightning struck as the asylum came into view, illuminating the awful place in a terrible eye-squinting light for just one terrible second. And then thunder rumbled evilly. Edward was led down a long, narrow hallway, his scissor hands clinking ominously against the walls. The asylum was a bleak and forbidding place, with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, and the sound of distant screams echoed through the corridors. The workers who accompanied Edward were cold and aloof, their faces set in hard lines of disapproval. They prodded him with sharp sticks, forcing him to move faster, despite the obvious discomfort caused by his scissor hands. Edward felt like an animal being herded to slaughter, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of horrors awaited him in this place. When they finally reached his cell, Edward was horrified by the conditions. The room was tiny, with barely enough space for the narrow cot that sat against the wall. The mattress was thin and lumpy, and the sheets were stained and threadbare. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. The workers shoved Edward roughly into the cell, slamming the door shut behind him. He heard the sound of a key turning in the lock, and knew that he was trapped. He sat down on the edge of the cot, his scissor hands clattering against the metal frame. As he sat there, he could hear the sounds of other patients in nearby cells. Some were shouting and raving, while others moaned softly to themselves. The air was thick with despair and desperation, and Edward knew that he had truly fallen into a nightmare. Over the coming days and weeks, Edward would endure terrible conditions and cruel treatment at the hands of the asylum workers. They would beat him, starve him, and subject him to all manner of unspeakable torments. But through it all, Edward began to imagine that someday, somehow, he would find a way to escape this place and seek revenge against those who had wronged him. He'd all but forgotten the love he'd once held for the Boggs family. Esmerelda, the angry neighbor from back in town, was admitted to the asylum a few months after Edward. She had always been an odd woman, prone to religious fervor and mystical visions. But in recent years, her fanaticism had taken a dark turn. She had become convinced that the world was ending, and that only the most pure and righteous would be saved. Esmerelda had spent the last few years in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, preaching to anyone who would listen about the coming apocalypse. Her sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, and she had a fierce intensity that few could match. But as the years wore on, her followers dwindled, and she grew increasingly isolated and paranoid. Eventually, Esmerelda's obsession drove her to madness. She began to hear voices, to see visions of demons and angels battling for the fate of the world. She would spend hours in a trance, speaking in tongues and writing feverishly in a small journal. It was this madness that led to her being admitted to the asylum. She had been found wandering the streets in a state of delirium, screaming about the end of the world and the coming of the Antichrist. When Edward first encountered Esmerelda in the asylum, he was struck by her intensity. She had a wild look in her eyes, and her hair was matted and unkempt. But despite her appearance, there was a sense of power and purpose emanating from her. Over time, Edward and Esmerelda struck up an unlikely friendship. They would spend hours talking, discussing the nature of God and the fate of the world. Esmerelda's visions had taken on a new urgency, and she was convinced that Edward was somehow connected to the events that were unfolding. Edward became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, consumed by his anger and hatred. He started to see himself as a victim, and his Scissorhands as a means to gain power and control. Esmerelda's influence over Edward grew stronger, until he was completely under her spell. She convinced him to escape from the asylum and embark on a rampage of destruction and chaos. Edward was fueled by rage, and Esmerelda was compelled by sheer madness. Edward and Esmerelda waited until the moon had risen high in the sky before making their move. The asylum was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional creak of floorboards. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the bright lights of the security cameras. The guards were on high alert, and any misstep could mean disaster. As they crept down the long, dimly lit hallways, Edward couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. It had been years since he had felt so alive, so free. Finally, they reached the exit. It was a heavy metal door, with multiple locks and a keypad. But Esmerelda had a trick up her sleeve. She produced a small wire from her pocket and began to pick the locks with practiced ease. Within moments, the door swung open, revealing the inky darkness beyond. Edward and Esmerelda stepped out into the cool night air, breathing in the sweet scent of freedom. They ran, their feet pounding against the pavement. It felt like they were flying, like they were finally breaking free from the chains that had bound them for so long. As they ran, Edward could feel his mind clearing, his thoughts racing with a newfound energy. He wasn't sure where they were going, or what would happen next. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Eventually, they reached the edge of town, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They paused for a moment, looking out over the silent streets. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of police sirens. Without a word, they took off again, running towards the hills that loomed in the distance. Edward knew that they were heading towards his old home, the Gothic castle on the mountain. As they climbed higher and higher, Edward could feel his excitement building. He wasn't sure what was waiting for them at the top, but he knew that it was going to be something incredible. Something that would change their lives forever. Together, they returned to the nearby town, where Edward Scissorhands became a weapon of terror, cutting through anything and anyone who stood in their way. The people of the town were terrified, and they quickly realized that they had created a monster. But it was too late. Edward Scissorhands had become a force of darkness, consumed by his own rage and hatred. And Esmerelda, his bitter enemy, was the only one who could stop him. As the town was plunged into chaos, Esmerelda realized that she had created a monster. She had manipulated Edward into embracing his dark side, and now there was no turning back. But even as Edward rampaged through the town, cutting down everything in his path, a part of him still clung to his humanity. He struggled with the knowledge that he was hurting innocent people, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. Esmerelda, on the other hand, reveled in the destruction. She had always been an outcast, and now she finally had the power and control she had always craved. She goaded Edward on, urging him to cause even more destruction. As the night wore on, the chaos grew worse. The streets were filled with the sounds of screaming and the smell of blood. But even in the midst of the carnage, there were those who were determined to stop Edward. The Boggs family, who had turned on Edward and betrayed him, now realized the error of their ways. They joined forces with the police and the townspeople, determined to put an end to Edward's rampage. The battle was long and fierce, with Edward cutting down anyone who stood in his way. But eventually, the Boggs family was able to get close enough to him to reason with him. They reminded him of who he truly was and how much they had cared for him. Gradually, Edward began to remember the kindness that the Boggs family had shown him. He realized that he didn't want to hurt anyone anymore, and he turned on Esmerelda, his bitter enemy. In the final showdown, Edward faced off against Esmerelda, wielding his scissor hands with deadly accuracy. She was a formidable opponent, but in the end, Edward emerged victorious. As the sun began to rise over the town, Edward looked out at the destruction he had caused. He knew that he could never go back to the way things were before, but he also knew that he had the power to make a difference. With the help of the Boggs family, he began to use his scissor hands for good. He worked to rebuild the town and to make amends for the harm he had caused. And even though he would always be an outsider, he finally found a sense of belonging and purpose. The town accepted Edward once again, but he would never know that it was only out of fear of Dark Edward Scissorhands.